At 3:12 in the morning, Israel's civilian airspace effectively stopped functioning. Departures were suspended, incoming flights were diverted, civil aviation alerts escalated from precaution to operational shutdown in less than an hour. What began as a military exchange turned by dawn into something far larger. Not simply another strike, not simply another round of escalation, but a direct interruption of Israel's connection to the outside world. And the most important part of that story is not the missiles themselves. It is the logic behind the target selection. Because the real objective was not just fear, it was not even physical damage in the narrow military sense. The real objective was to make ordinary economic life impossible, to prove that a country can retain military power and still be strategically cornered if its civilian systems become too dangerous to use. Subscribe now and turn on notifications because this is the part of the conflict most people miss in the first wave of coverage. The headlines focus on explosions. The deeper story is about access, insurance, risk, confidence, and the cost of making an air corridor unreliable. That is where the strategic weight of this event actually sits. To understand why this matters, it is necessary to start with a basic fact that often gets buried under the language of retaliation and deterrence. Airspace is not just geography. Airspace is an economic operating system. When a country's civilian airspace becomes unstable, every sector that depends on speed, reliability, and international movement begins to absorb shock at the same time. Passenger routes are disrupted first because they are the most visible. But the deeper damage spreads through cargo schedules, insurance premiums, aircraft positioning, crew rotations, business travel, emergency medical movement, tourism flows, investor confidence, and the broader perception of whether the country remains commercially predictable. The public sees canceled flights. Markets see rising risk. Airlines see liability. Insurers see exposure. And once those assessments begin to change, the strategic consequences extend well beyond the duration of the original attack. That is why the phrase, "Iran just shut down Israel's airspace," needs to be understood carefully. In the literal sense, civilian authorities and airlines make those operational decisions. Not the missile itself. But in strategic terms, the result is the same. If the threat environment becomes serious enough that commercial aviation can no longer function with confidence, then the airspace has been shut down in practice even before every runway is physically damaged. This distinction matters because it reveals the part of the event that is still underreported. The central question is not only whether infrastructure was hit. The central question is whether normal civilian aviation can continue to exist under the expectation of repeatable ballistic threat. That is a much bigger question, and it does not end when the fire is out or the debris is cleared. Ben Gurion is not just another airport on a national map. It is the central aviation artery of the Israeli economy. It handles the overwhelming share of international passenger traffic. It supports cargo movement, diplomatic travel, business access, tourism, and a large portion of the country's commercial connection to Europe, North America, and beyond. There are other airfields in Israel, there are military runways, there are smaller civilian facilities, but there is a difference between having runways and having an airport ecosystem that can sustain large-scale, long-haul international commercial traffic. Wide-body aircraft, heavy passenger volumes, consistent customs infrastructure, ground handling capacity, fuel logistics, security systems, maintenance, and scheduling density cannot simply be recreated overnight by shifting operations elsewhere. This is why the target matters. A strike or threat against the central aviation hub of a country does more than interrupt travel. It tests whether that country can maintain the appearance and function of normality under sustained pressure. And that brings us to the real reason this is not being reported clearly enough. Most early coverage treats airspace shutdown as a temporary security measure, something procedural, almost routine in a war environment. But temporary closure is only the first layer. The more consequential layer is the message sent to airlines, lessors, insurers, global firms, and foreign governments. The message is that the risk calculus has changed. A single successful disruption can be absorbed. Repeated evidence that disruption is possible changes behavior. Airlines do not need every aircraft to be hit in order to stop operating. Now, they only need to conclude that the probability of loss is no longer acceptable relative to the reward. The same is true for insurers. The same is true for multinational firms deciding where to station personnel. The same is true for cargo planners choosing between speed and survivability. In other words, the true target may not have been the runway alone. It may have been confidence itself. That is the underreported logic here. Missiles can damage infrastructure, but strategic pressure campaigns aim at something harder to rebuild than concrete. They aim at trust. Trust that flights will depart on time. Trust that landing slots will remain open. Trust that crews will not be stranded. Trust that passengers will keep booking. Trust that supply chains routed by air can still meet deadlines. Why not trust that a nation's global links are resilient enough to survive military stress? If that trust weakens, then the economic effect multiplies. Not because every asset is destroyed, but because every decision maker begins pricing in the expectation of future disruption. That is how a military action becomes an economic weapon. The technical side matters here as well because this was not only about range or explosive power, it was about penetration of defensive certainty. Modern air defense does not need to be totally destroyed to create strategic consequences. It only needs to be shown to have limits. Once those limits are demonstrated in a visible and economically sensitive area, the outcome ripples outward. Civil aviation is especially vulnerable to this because it cannot operate in the gray zone. Airlines do not function on patriotic messaging. They function on timetables, actuarial models, maintenance windows, insured hull values, passenger demand forecasts, and crew safety protocols. Military planners can accept risk levels that civilian operators cannot. That asymmetry is one of the most important parts of this story, because it means an adversary can impose enormous economic stress without needing total battlefield superiority. The mechanics of how that pressure is applied are often misunderstood. In public discussions, the focus tends to fall on the interception question. How many missiles were launched? How many were detected? How many were intercepted? But the deeper question for strategic planners is different. The deeper question is whether the defensive architecture can maintain credibility over time. Air defense systems like Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow were designed to reduce damage and protect population centers. They are extremely effective within the parameters they were built for. But every defensive system has a mathematical ceiling. When multiple vectors, maneuvering warheads, decoys, or saturation tactics are introduced, the system must divide its attention across a larger number of simultaneous targets. This is not a failure in the traditional sense. It is a reflection of the simple fact that defensive systems must respond, while offensive systems choose the timing, angle, and concentration of attack. What matters strategically is not whether every interceptor hits its target. What matters is whether attackers can create moments of uncertainty large enough to force civilian systems offline. If a country's airspace can be made unpredictable for even a few hours at a critical moment, airlines begin rerouting aircraft, delaying departures or diverting inbound flights. The physical infrastructure might remain intact, but the operational flow begins to break down. And aviation is an industry where continuity is everything. Aircraft operate on extremely tight scheduling cycles. Crews must rotate within strict legal limits. Aircraft require specific maintenance windows. Cargo shipments depend on synchronized arrival and departure slots across continents. Disrupt one link and the entire chain begins to adjust. This is where the economic dimension of the airspace shutdown becomes clearer. Every wide-body aircraft sitting idle represents an asset worth hundreds of millions of dollars that is suddenly producing no revenue. Every delayed cargo shipment disrupts downstream logistics networks that depend on just-in-time delivery. Pharmaceutical shipments, electronics, specialized machinery, and perishable goods move primarily by air because of speed and reliability. When those flights pause, the cost is not only measured in ticket refunds, it is measured in delayed manufacturing, disrupted supply chains, and contracts that fail to execute on time. Even short interruptions can ripple through global commerce in ways that take weeks to normalize. Insurance markets amplify that effect even further. Aviation insurance is structured around risk modeling. Insurers calculate premiums based on the probability of loss. A sudden demonstration that a key aviation hub can come under ballistic threat forces insurers to reevaluate those probabilities. The question they must answer is simple but consequential. What is the likelihood that aircraft operating in that airspace could be damaged or destroyed in a repeat event? If that probability increases even slightly, premiums rise. If the probability crosses certain thresholds, insurers may restrict coverage entirely or demand government guarantees before airlines can continue operating there. This is where the strategic leverage becomes visible. Military strikes create the initial disruption, but insurance decisions determine how long the disruption lasts. If insurers decide that operating in a specific airspace represents unacceptable risk, airlines cannot legally or financially continue normal operations. Aircraft leases require coverage. Airports require liability protection. Crew safety regulations depend on risk assessments. Without insurance, the aviation system simply stops. That means the most significant long-term consequence of an airspace shutdown may not come from the missiles themselves, but from the financial recalculations that follow. The Israeli economy is deeply integrated into global markets, and aviation is a central part of that integration. High-tech exports, international investment flows, and global business travel rely on fast and reliable connections. When those connections become unstable, the economic signal travels quickly through corporate planning departments and financial institutions. Investors begin asking whether supply chains remain dependable. Companies reconsider travel schedules and regional headquarters decisions. Tourism operators watch bookings decline as travelers seek destinations perceived as safer. None of these reactions require permanent damage to infrastructure. They only require uncertainty about future access. There is also a military logistics dimension that receives less attention in early reporting. Civilian aviation infrastructure often supports military operations indirectly. Transport aircraft, logistics movement, and supply coordination sometimes depend on shared facilities or nearby airspace corridors. When civilian airspace becomes constrained, military logistics must adjust as well. That can increase operational complexity at precisely the moment when armed forces require maximum flexibility. Again, the objective is not necessarily to destroy military capacity outright. The objective is to complicate the environment in which that capacity operates. Historical comparisons help illuminate why this approach appears repeatedly in modern conflicts. Strategic infrastructure has long been targeted not only for its physical importance but for its psychological and economic ripple effects. Airports, ports, rail hubs, and energy facilities are nodes where civilian life and national capability intersect. Disrupting them sends a message far beyond the immediate blast radius. It tells markets that stability has been punctured. It tells citizens that routine activity is no longer guaranteed. And it tells international partners that operating inside that system now carries additional risk. But there is an important asymmetry in how such strategies unfold. Offensive systems can be deployed selectively and briefly, while defensive systems must maintain constant vigilance. That imbalance means attackers can concentrate resources for short periods, while defenders must spread resources continuously across many potential targets. Over time, that dynamic can produce moments where even advanced defense networks struggle to maintain total coverage. Again, this does not mean the defenses are ineffective. It means the contest becomes one of endurance, adaptation, and technological evolution. For Israel, the strategic challenge now becomes twofold. First, it must restore confidence in the safety and reliability of its civilian airspace. That involves demonstrating that defensive measures can intercept or neutralize future threats before they disrupt aviation operations. Second, it must reassure international partners, airlines, and insurers that the probability of repeated disruption remains low enough for normal economic activity to resume. Both tasks require more than repairing infrastructure. They require rebuilding trust in the protective systems surrounding that infrastructure. The broader conflict will also influence how quickly that confidence returns. If missile exchanges continue or expand geographically, the perception of risk may linger even after immediate damage is repaired. Conversely, if defensive improvements and diplomatic pressure reduce the likelihood of further strikes, airlines and insurers may gradually restore normal operations. In other words, the timeline for reopening airspace is not purely a technical question. It is a strategic and psychological one as well. From Iran's perspective, the demonstration of vulnerability may have been the central objective. Military planners often aim to show that a specific system, location, or economic node can be reached despite defensive layers. Once that demonstration occurs, the strategic conversation shifts. Instead of asking whether a strike is possible, analysts begin asking how often it could be repeated. That shift alone can alter the risk environment. The coming weeks will therefore revolve around several critical indicators. Airlines will evaluate whether to maintain suspended routes or resume flights. Insurance firms will adjust their risk models and coverage terms. Defense analysts will study the engagement data to determine how defensive systems responded and where improvements are needed. And policymakers will consider whether escalation or negotiation better serves their long-term interests. In the immediate aftermath, the event may appear to be another episode in a long chain of regional military exchanges. But when viewed through the lens of infrastructure, economics, and confidence, it represents something more consequential. It shows how modern conflict increasingly targets the systems that sustain normal life, rather than only the forces that fight wars. The airspace disruption demonstrates that strategic leverage in the 21st century often lies not in occupying territory but in shaping the environment where economies operate. Interrupt that environment long enough and the pressure becomes cumulative. Supply chains strain, investors hesitate, airlines withdraw. And even countries with powerful militaries find themselves confronting a different type of vulnerability. The next phase will determine whether this disruption remains a temporary shock or evolves into a longer economic challenge. If defensive systems adapt quickly and international aviation confidence returns, the episode may become a brief but intense moment in the conflict. If confidence erodes further, the consequences could extend far beyond the initial strike. That is the deeper reason this story matters. It is not only about missiles in the night sky. It is about whether a nation can maintain open channels to the global system under sustained pressure. Subscribe for future analysis as more information becomes available. When insurance decisions, airline responses, and defensive adjustments become clearer, we will examine what they mean for the region and the global economy. Before you go, consider one question. If airspace disruptions become a recurring feature of this conflict, how will airlines, insurers, and investors adapt their behavior? Because the answer to that question may shape the next phase of the crisis far more than any single missile strike. The next phase of this situation will not be determined by the explosions that already happened. It will be determined by the decisions that follow them. When a country's airspace experiences a disruption like this, the first reaction is operational. Flights pause, aircraft divert, safety protocols activate. But the second reaction, the one that matters strategically, happens quietly in boardrooms, insurance offices, and aviation control centers across the world. Airlines now begin asking a simple question. Can we reliably operate here tomorrow? If the answer is uncertain, routes shift elsewhere. That is not a political decision. It is a financial one. A wide-body aircraft represents an investment often exceeding $200 million. Airlines operate those aircraft on thin margins and tightly calculated schedules. Every hour of uncertainty translates into measurable financial risk. When airspace instability enters the equation, the economics of aviation change quickly. Crews cannot be sent into environments where insurers refuse coverage. Aircraft cannot be dispatched to destinations where the probability of diversion becomes too high. Passengers will not book flights they believe may not arrive. These reactions compound. One canceled route leads to another. Aircraft repositioning spreads through the network. Connections fail. Cargo schedules slip. The aviation system begins adjusting itself in real time. Cargo aviation is particularly sensitive to these changes. Much of the world's high-value trade moves through aircraft holds rather than cargo ships. Medical supplies, electronics, pharmaceuticals, advanced manufacturing components, and time-sensitive industrial goods depend on reliable air corridors. When those corridors become unpredictable, logistics planners begin rerouting shipments through alternative hubs. That process may sound minor, but it shifts billions of dollars of economic activity away from the disrupted region. For Israel, which depends heavily on international trade and technological exports, that ripple matters. Technology firms rely on rapid access to international markets. Venture capital investment often involves frequent cross-border travel. Research partnerships require movement of both people and equipment. When airspace disruptions introduce friction into those movements, the effect gradually reaches sectors far removed from the original military event. This is why the strategic logic of airspace disruption focuses on persistence rather than immediate destruction. The aim is to introduce enough instability that each new business decision becomes slightly more cautious than the last. Investors delay projects, conferences move elsewhere, Airlines reduce frequencies. Tour operators pause bookings. None of these actions individually determine the outcome of a conflict, but together they create a slow economic pressure that continues long after the missiles stop flying. Historical examples show how quickly aviation confidence can change. After the attacks of September 11th, global aviation insurance costs increased dramatically overnight. Entire airline fleets were temporarily grounded because coverage could not be guaranteed. Governments had to intervene with emergency insurance frameworks simply to keep flights operating. In other cases, regional conflicts have caused airlines to avoid entire corridors of airspace for months or even years, rerouting around areas perceived as unsafe. The difference in this case lies in geography. Israel's aviation network is highly centralized. A significant portion of international traffic flows through one primary hub. That efficiency normally provides advantages in logistics and scheduling, but it also means that disruption at that hub can have outsized consequences compared with countries whose air traffic spreads across multiple large airports. This is why the current situation is being examined closely by analysts beyond the region. It represents a test case in modern conflict. Can a country's economic connectivity be weakened not by destroying its industries directly, but by repeatedly challenging the safety of the infrastructure that connects those industries to the outside world? The answer will depend on how effectively defensive systems adapt and how quickly confidence returns. The technological race surrounding missile defense is therefore entering a new phase. Defensive systems must not only intercept incoming threats but also reassure civilian industries that the probability of disruption remains extremely low. That reassurance requires visible reliability. Airlines, insurers, and passengers need evidence that the protective systems surrounding key infrastructure are capable of responding to evolving threats. If defensive upgrades succeed, the disruption may prove temporary. Flights will gradually resume, cargo networks will stabilize, insurance premiums may remain elevated for some time, but the system will return to something resembling normal operation. That scenario represents the best case. It assumes technological adaptation, de-escalation of hostilities, and renewed confidence in the safety of civilian infrastructure. The worst-case scenario looks very different. If missile exchanges continue and airspace closures become periodic rather than exceptional, airlines may begin shifting long-term operations away from the region. Once global aviation networks adjust to new routing patterns, reversing those changes becomes difficult. Air traffic hubs build their strength through reliability. If reliability disappears, the aviation ecosystem gradually relocates itself. Between those two extremes lies the most likely outcome, a prolonged period of uncertainty. During this period, aviation will operate cautiously. Flights will resume, but under tighter monitoring and higher insurance costs. Airlines will maintain contingency plans. Governments will invest heavily in improved defensive systems. And every new incident will trigger another round of reassessment in the global aviation industry. The military dimension of the conflict will continue to dominate headlines. But beneath those headlines, the economic contest will quietly unfold. Infrastructure resilience, supply chain adaptation, and international confidence will shape the long-term consequences far more than any single exchange of missiles. What this episode ultimately demonstrates is the evolving nature of strategic pressure in the modern world. Traditional warfare aimed to destroy armies and occupy territory. Contemporary conflict increasingly targets the networks that allow economies to function. Airports, ports, energy systems, and digital infrastructure have become the critical nodes where military capability and civilian life intersect. Interrupt those nodes, even temporarily, and the consequences spread through financial markets, transportation systems, and international relationships. The battlefield expands beyond physical territory into the systems that support global commerce. In that sense, the airspace disruption represents more than an isolated event. It illustrates how 21st century conflicts can reshape economic behavior without necessarily achieving decisive military victories. Strategic leverage now often comes from influencing how safe, predictable, and connected a nation appears to the outside world. For now, the key indicators to watch are straightforward: airline schedules, insurance announcements, defensive system upgrades, and the frequency of further attacks targeting infrastructure rather than purely military sites. Those signals will reveal whether the disruption remains a short-term shock or develops into a longer strategic campaign. The coming weeks will likely bring new information, new data, and new analysis as investigators examine how the airspace shutdown unfolded and how the defenses responded. As those details emerge, they will provide clearer insight into the future trajectory of the conflict. Subscribe for future updates when those developments become clearer. When aviation insurers finalize their risk assessments, when airlines confirm whether routes will resume, and when defense analysts publish deeper evaluations of the engagement, the analysis will be here. Before you go, consider one final question. If airspace disruption becomes a recurring strategy in modern conflicts, how will countries adapt their economic systems to survive it? Because the answer to that question may shape the future of warfare far more than any single missile strike.